I still remember the smell of rain on the asphalt that evening, the way the streetlights on Elm Street blurred into long, bleeding streaks of amber and red across my windshield. It was a Tuesday, the kind of mundane, middle-of-the-week night where nothing is supposed to happen. I had been living in that suburban house for 6 years with my wife, Sarah, and our 7-year-old son, Toby. It was a good life, or at least it was the life I had built with every ounce of sweat and long hours I could muster. I worked as a project manager for a commercial construction firm, which meant my schedule was brutal. Early mornings, late nights, and a constant low-grade exhaustion that settled deep into my bones. But I did it for them. Everything was always for them. 2 months prior to that rainy Tuesday, my childhood best friend Mark hit rock bottom. Mark and I had been inseparable since our days playing high school football in Ohio. He was the charismatic one, the guy who could talk his way out of a speeding ticket or into a VIP lounge. But life has a way of catching up to guys like that. His marriage had imploded in a messy, expensive divorce. His freelance graphic design business was tanking, and he ended up evicted from his apartment with nothing but 3 duffel bags and a vintage guitar. When he called me from a rest stop on I-95, sounding smaller than I'd ever heard him, I didn't even hesitate. I told him he could crash on our living room couch until he got back on his feet.
Sarah had been hesitant at first, citing our lack of space and Toby's routine, but I convinced her. He's family, I told her. You don't turn your back on family. For the first few weeks, it actually worked out better than I expected. Mark was helpful around the house, he mowed the lawn without being asked, and he was fantastic with Toby, playing video games with him and helping him construct elaborate Lego forts in the den. Sarah seemed to warm up to him too, cooking larger dinners and laughing at his endless library of dry, self-deprecating jokes. I felt a sense of pride seeing my home become a sanctuary for my oldest friend. I felt like the anchor holding everyone together. But as the weeks bled into months, the atmosphere in the house began to shift in subtle ways that I was too tired to fully comprehend. It started with small things. I'd come home at 9 o'clock at night, completely drained from arguing with subcontractors, and find the 3 of them sitting around the kitchen island, finishing a bottle of wine, laughing at an inside joke that died the moment I walked through the door. I tried to join in, but I was a wet blanket, too exhausted to match their energy. Mark would always offer me his seat, polite to a fault, but the momentum of the room would already be gone. I started feeling like a ghost in my own home, a financial provider who popped in to sleep and shower before disappearing back into the concrete jungle. The project I was managing down in Savannah was nearing its completion phase, which meant my stress levels were through the roof. I was drinking too much coffee, sleeping barely 4 hours a night, and my communication with Sarah had dwindled to logistical text messages about groceries, Toby's soccer practice, and utility bills. We hadn't slept in the same bed with any real intimacy in months. Every time I reached for her, she was either too tired, had a headache, or Toby was sleeping restlessly in the next room. I understood it. Being a stay-at-home mom was grueling in its own right, and having a long-term house guest adds a layer of performance to your daily life that wears you down. I kept telling myself that once this project wrapped up, I'd take her to Cabo, just the 2 of us. We just needed to get through the winter. On that specific Tuesday, I was supposed to stay overnight at a hotel near the Savannah job site. A critical concrete pour was scheduled for 5 a.m. the next morning, and my boss wanted me on site to oversee the inspectors. I checked into the Quality Inn around 6:30 p.m., grabbed a greasy burger from the diner next door, and went to my room. But at 7:45 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was the site foreman. The concrete delivery trucks had been delayed by a massive supply chain hiccup at the regional plant. The pour was pushed back by 48 hours. There was no point in me sitting in a stale hotel room all night when my own bed was just an hour and a half away. I felt a sudden, desperate surge of relief. I could go home, surprise Sarah, crawl into my own bed, and maybe, just maybe, we could have an actual conversation. I checked out of the hotel, hopped into my truck, and hit the highway. The rain started pouring about 30 minutes into the drive, heavy and relentless, the windshield wipers slapping a steady, hypnotic rhythm. As I drove, I started thinking about how lucky I was. Despite the exhaustion, I had a beautiful wife who had stuck by me since college, a healthy son who looked up to me, and the means to help a friend in need. I felt a rare wave of warmth. I decided I wouldn't text Sarah. I wanted to see the look of genuine surprise on her face when I walked through the front door early. I wanted to catch them in the middle of a normal, quiet evening and just slide right back into my place as the head of the household. When I finally turned down our street, the neighborhood was completely dark, save for the flickering blue glow of televisions through living room windows. It was just past 9:30 p.m. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed Mark's battered old sedan was parked on the street, and Sarah's SUV was in its usual spot. The lights in the downstairs living room were off, but the kitchen light was casting a soft yellow square onto the wet grass outside. I cut the engine, the sudden silence inside the truck amplified by the heavy drumming of rain on the roof. I grabbed my overnight bag from the passenger seat, pulled my hood up, and walked quickly up the concrete path to the porch. I used my key, turning it slowly and quietly in the lock so I wouldn't wake Toby if he was already asleep. The door creaked open just a fraction of an inch, and the warm, familiar scent of our home washed over me. Cinnamon candles, roasted chicken, and the faint, sweet smell of the fabric softener Sarah always bought. I stepped into the foyer, closing the door behind me with practiced gentleness, clicking the latch into place without a sound. The house was incredibly quiet, the kind of stillness that feels heavy, almost deliberate. I set my bag down on the entryway bench and slipped my wet boots off. I expected to hear the low murmur of the television from the den, or perhaps the sound of Mark strumming his guitar softly in the basement, but there was nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I walked down the short hallway toward the kitchen, thinking I'd grab a glass of water before heading upstairs. As I bypassed the living room, I glanced toward the couch where Mark usually slept. The blankets were neatly folded at the foot of the sofa. The decorative pillows were perfectly arranged. He wasn't there. I assumed he was downstairs in the finished basement, or perhaps out for a walk, though the weather made that unlikely. I walked into the kitchen and noticed 2 empty wine glasses sitting in the sink, a few drops of dark red liquid still clinging to the crystal. A half-empty bottle of Cabernet was sitting on the counter next to a small plate with the remnants of some cheese and crackers. It looked like they had a nice evening. I smiled faintly, glad that Sarah had some company while I was away, though a small, sharp prick of exclusion poked up my chest again. I turned off the kitchen light, plunging the downstairs into complete darkness, and began to make my way up the carpeted stairs. I trod lightly, instinctively avoiding the third step from the top that always squeaked. The hallway upstairs was dark, but the door to Toby's room was cracked open, a sliver of his dinosaur nightlight casting a green glow across the carpet. I stepped up to his door and peered in. He was fast asleep, buried under his heavy comforter, his breathing slow and rhythmic. I felt that familiar, fierce surge of paternal love. Everything I did was for him. I stepped away from his door and turned toward the master bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was completely shut, which was unusual for Sarah when I was away. She usually kept it cracked so she could hear Toby. A strange, inexplicable tightness formed in my throat. It wasn't suspicion, not yet. It was just an instinct, that primal human radar that registers an anomaly before the brain can process it. As I approached the door, I realized there was no light bleeding out from the bottom crack. The room was dark. I reached out, my fingers wrapping around the cold brass doorknob. I turned it slowly, intending to slip inside, undress in the dark, and surprise her by climbing into bed. The door swung open smoothly, without a sound. The heavy drapes were drawn, blocking out the streetlights, but my eyes had adjusted to the darkness of the hallway. The master bed was positioned directly opposite the door. In the dim, ambient light filtering in from the hallway behind me, I could see the shape of the blankets. There were 2 distinct forms under the sheets. My heart didn't slam against my ribs. It did something worse. It seemed to stop entirely, freezing the blood in my veins into shards of ice. I stood frozen in the doorway, my hand still resting on the inside doorknob, my breath catching in my throat. The silhouette on the left was Sarah, lying on her side, her long hair spilled across the white pillowcase. The silhouette on the right was a man, his large frame shifting slightly in his sleep, one heavy arm draped casually, possessively over Sarah's waist. The silver watch on his wrist, the one I had given him for his 30th birthday, caught the faint glint of the hallway light. It was Mark. The world seemed to lose its audio. The sound of the rain outside vanished. The hum of the house disappeared. There was only the sound of my own ragged, shallow breathing and the quiet, synchronized respiration of the 2 people I trusted most in the world, sleeping peacefully in the bed I had paid for, in the life I had built. I didn't scream. I didn't rush the bed. I didn't feel the immediate fire of rage. Instead, a profound, crushing numbness washed over me, a sensation so heavy that I felt my knees weaken.
I felt like I was looking at a photograph of someone else's life, a horrific crime scene that had nothing to do with me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching the slow rise and fall of the blanket over them. Then Sarah stirred. She made a small, soft sound in her throat, a sound I knew intimately, and shifted closer into his chest. Mark's arm tightened around her, his fingers brushing against the small of her back in a gesture that was so fluid, so casual. It was undeniable that this was not the first time. It was a routine. I backed out of the room, my bare feet making no sound on the carpet. I pulled the door shut until it clicked softly, sealing them back into their betrayal. I walked down the stairs like a man operating a machine that wasn't his own body. I reached the front door, grabbed my boots and my overnight bag, and stepped back out into the freezing, relentless rain. The rain felt different once I was outside.
It wasn't just weather anymore. It was a physical weight pressing down on my skull, soaking through my jacket within seconds as I stood on the asphalt of my own driveway. I didn't get back into my truck immediately. I just stood there, staring up at the dark window of our master bedroom. From the outside, the house looked perfectly peaceful, a picture-perfect slice of American suburban bliss, with its manicured lawn and the neat little flower beds Sarah had planted in the spring. It was a lie. The whole thing was a beautifully constructed theater set, and I had just walked backstage to find the actors laughing at me. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely unlock the truck door. When I finally climbed inside, the cabin smelled like stale coffee and the old leather of my work boots, the smells of my labor, the smells of the life I thought I was protecting. I started the engine, but I didn't turn on the headlights. I didn't want the bright beams to flash against the bedroom window and alert them. I backed out of the driveway slowly, navigating by the dim amber glow of the streetlights, until I reached the end of the block. Only then did I turn on the lights and drive. I had nowhere to go. My mind was a chaotic static of images, the silver watch on Mark's wrist, the casual way his arm rested on her waist, the small, contented sound Sarah made when she shifted against him. It was the familiarity of it that killed me. It wasn't a drunken mistake. It wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment. It was a habit. They had a rhythm. While I was standing in the mud on construction sites in Savannah, arguing with contractors and eating lukewarm fast food alone in a motel room, my best friend was slipping into my bed, and my wife was welcoming him. I drove aimlessly for an hour, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. I ended up in the parking lot of a 24-hour Walmart on the edge of town. It was nearly 11 o'clock. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few scattered cars under the harsh, buzzing halogen lights. I turned off the engine and just sat there, staring at the bright blue sign in the distance. The silence inside the truck was deafening now. The numbness was beginning to wear off, replaced by a cold, sharp panic that made it hard to breathe. Who was I supposed to call? My parents lived in Florida, retired and fragile. Telling them would shatter their world too. My work friends were just that, men I talked to about concrete pours and budget spreadsheets. And my best friend, the guy I would have called to help me bury a body, the guy who had been the best man at my wedding, was currently sleeping next to my wife. I was completely, utterly isolated. I pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over Sarah's name and my contacts. I wanted to call her, to wake her up with a screaming tirade, to force her to explain how she could do this to us, to Toby. But a cold, calculating instinct stopped me. If I called now, if I went back there raging, they would have the opportunity to concoct a story, to minimize it, or worse, Mark would pack his bags and disappear before I could figure out exactly how deep this rot went. I needed to know everything. I needed to know when it started, how long it had been going on, and exactly how much of my life had been a joke. I spent the rest of the night in the parking lot, drifting in and out of a shallow, agitated sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. I saw Mark playing Legos with Toby on the living room floor, laughing and being the fun uncle, while knowing that just hours later, he'd be upstairs with Toby's mother. The disgust that washed over me was physical. I actually had to open the truck door at one point, retching into the wet asphalt, though nothing came up but stomach acid. By 5:30 a.m., the sky was turning a sickly, bruised shade of gray. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle. The world was waking up. People were pulling into the parking lot in their work clothes, grabbing coffee, starting their shifts. My phone buzzed in my lap. It was a text from Sarah. "Morning, babe. Hope the concrete pour goes well today. We miss you. Text me when you get a break." I stared at the screen for 5 full minutes. The casualness of it, the exclamation points, the easy performance of a loving, supportive wife. It was terrifying. How many times had she sent me texts like that while sitting at the kitchen island with him? How many times had she smiled at her phone, knowing I was hundreds of miles away, completely blind? I forced my thumbs to type a response. My hands were stiff from the cold. "Thanks. It's going to be a long day. Probably won't be home until late tonight. Talk later." I hit send. I needed to buy myself time. I needed to walk into that house when they weren't expecting me, but in broad daylight, when they couldn't pretend it was a dream or a misunderstanding. I needed to see their faces when they realized they had been caught. I drove to a local diner, ordered a black coffee, and sat in a booth in the corner, staring out the window. The coffee tasted like copper, but I drank it anyway, needing the caffeine to keep the fog in my brain at bay. I formulated a plan. It was a clinical, detached process, the same way I managed a failing construction project. Break it down into phases. Keep emotion out of it until the data is gathered. I waited until 10 a.m. By then, Toby would be at school. He was dropped off by the school bus at 8:15 a.m., and Sarah usually went to the grocery store or the gym afterward, or so she told me. Mark, who claimed to be doing freelance work from the house, would likely be there alone, or perhaps they would be together, thinking they had the whole day to themselves since I was supposed to be in Savannah. When I pulled back onto our street, my heart was beating in a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. Mark's sedan was still parked on the street. Sarah's SUV was in the driveway. They were both home. I parked a few houses down, out of direct line of sight from the front windows. I walked up the sidewalk, the morning air crisp and damp. The neighborhood was quiet. Families gone to work, kids at school. It was the picture of peace. I didn't use my key this time. I walked up to the front door and knocked, loud and sharp, 3 distinct raps that echoed through the quiet porch. It took a moment. Then I heard footsteps approaching the door. Light, quick footsteps. Sarah's footsteps. The deadbolt turned. The door opened. Sarah stood there, holding a mug of coffee, wearing her favorite oversized gray sweater, the one I bought her for Christmas. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun. When she saw me, her entire face went slack. The easy, morning warm smile she was probably preparing for a delivery driver or a neighbor vanished instantly, replaced by a flash of absolute naked terror. It was only for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. Then the mask slipped back on, though it didn't fit quite right. "David?" she stammered, her voice high and tight. What are you doing here? I thought you were in Savannah until tonight." "The pour got delayed," I said. My voice sounded flat, completely devoid of inflection. It didn't sound like my voice at all. I came home. I stepped past her into the foyer without waiting for her to invite me in. The house smelled like fresh coffee and bacon. It looked exactly the same as it had 12 hours ago, but now the illusions were gone. "Why didn't you text me?" she asked, following me closely, her voice laced with a rising panic she was trying desperately to hide. "You said you wouldn't be back until late. I could have made breakfast, or—" "Where's Mark?" I asked, turning around to face her in the living room. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes darted toward the hallway that led to the basement, then back to me. I think he's downstairs. Or maybe in the kitchen. David, you look terrible. Are you okay? Did something happen on the job?" She reached a hand out toward my arm, a comforting, wifely gesture. "Don't touch me," I said. She froze, her hand hovering in the air between us. The color drained from her face entirely, leaving her looking pale and hollow under the kitchen lights. "David, what's wrong?" "Get him up here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made her flinch. "Get him up here right now, Sarah." She didn't move for a long, agonizing moment. She just stared at me, her eyes wide, searchingly darting across my face as if she could find a glitch in the reality that was rapidly crashing down around her. She tried to play the confused wife for one last, desperate second. "David, you're scaring me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is going on with you?" "I'm not going to ask you again, Sarah," I said, my voice dangerously steady.
"Get him up here, or I go downstairs and drag him up myself."
The mask finally shattered. Her lip quivered, and the mug of coffee in her hand shook so violently that the dark liquid sloshed over the rim, scalding her fingers. She didn't even seem to feel it. She set the mug down on the entryway table with a sharp clatter and turned toward the basement stairs. "Mark," she called out. Her voice was cracked, stripped of all the casual warmth she'd used just moments before. "Mark, come up here, please." There was a heavy silence from the basement, followed by the sound of a chair scraping against the linoleum floor below. Then came the slow, thudding footsteps on the wooden stairs. Mark appeared at the top of the landing. He was wearing a pair of gray sweatpants and a faded college t-shirt. He had a laptop in one hand and a pen in the other, pretending to be deep in his graphic design work. But the moment his eyes met mine, his entire body went rigid. The color bled out of his face so fast it looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Hey, Dave," he said, trying to force a casual, brotherly grin that failed spectacularly. His voice was too high, his throat clearing nervously. "Didn't expect you back so soon, man. Everything okay with the project?" I looked at him. This was the guy who had held my son in the hospital hours after he was born. This was the guy I had bailed out of jail in our 20s. The guy I had given a key to my home when he had nowhere else to sleep. I looked at the silver watch on his left wrist, the metal catching the morning light filtering through the kitchen window. "I came home early last night," I said softly. The words seemed to physically strike both of them. Sarah let out a sharp, choked gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Mark froze, his grip tightening on his laptop until his knuckles turned white. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the weight of a betrayal that had finally been dragged into the light. "Dave, listen to me," Mark started, taking a step forward, his hands coming up in a defensive, placating gesture. "It's not what you think. Shut up," I said. The words weren't loud, but they had a jagged, lethal edge that stopped him instantly. "Don't you dare tell me it's not what I think." I stood in my bedroom doorway at 10 o'clock last night, Mark. I watched you. I watched both of you. Sarah dropped to her knees right there on the hardwood floor, her chest heaving as she dissolved in deep, ugly tears. "David, I'm so sorry," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I'm so sorry. It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. I swear to you, it didn't mean anything." "It didn't mean anything?" I echoed, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping my throat. "You were sleeping in my bed, Sarah, with my best friend, while our son was sleeping in the next room. How many times? How long has this been going on?" Neither of them answered. Sarah just kept crying, her shoulders shaking violently, while Mark stood near the kitchen island, his eyes locked on the floor, looking completely hollowed out. "How long, Mark?" I demanded, stepping closer to him. The numbness that had carried me through the night was finally evaporating, replaced by a roaring, white-hot fury that made my vision blur at the edges. "Look at me and tell me how long you've been screwing my wife in my own house." Mark swallowed hard, his jaw tight. He wouldn't look at me. "Since Christmas," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of Sarah sobbing. 6 months. Half a year. Every time I had come home from a grueling week on the road, exhausted and guilty for not being around more, they had been hiding this. Every dinner we ate together, every movie we watched as a family on the weekends, every time Mark thanked me for letting him stay on our couch, it was all a theater piece. They had been mocking me to my face, using my generosity to fund their affair, using my hard work to create a safe little cocoon for their secret life. 6 months, I whispered, the reality of it slicing through me like a razor. I brought you into my home. I fed you. I paid your bills. I gave you a place to rebuild your pathetic life. And you took my wife. David, please, Sarah begged, crawling forward a few inches on the floor, reaching out to grab the hem of my jeans. It wasn't like that. We didn't plan it. It just... We were both lonely, and you were always gone, and we just got caught up in it. Please, don't do this. Think about Toby. The mention of my son's name felt like a physical blow to my chest. The rage flared up, hot and uncontrollable. I kicked my leg back, pulling away from her touch as if she were venomous. Don't you dare use his name, I snarled, turning on her. You didn't think about Toby when you were bringing him into our bed. You didn't think about Toby when you were lying to my face every single day. You broke this family, Sarah. Not me. You. I looked back at Mark. He looked pathetic standing there, stripped of all his usual charm and bravado. He was just a coward who had stolen from the only person who had been willing to help him. You have 10 minutes, I told Mark, my voice dropping back down to that cold, dead register. Pack your bags. Get your guitar. Get everything you own and get out of my house. If you are still here in 10 minutes, I am going to forget that I have a son to raise, and I am going to take apart everything you have left. Mark didn't argue. He didn't say another word. He turned and practically fled down the basement stairs, his boots thudding against the wood in a frantic rush. Sarah was still on the floor, her face red and swollen, looking up at me with eyes full of a desperate, pleading terror. David, please talk to me. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. People get through this.
Please, don't throw away 8 years of marriage over this. The marriage is gone, Sarah, I said, looking down at her, feeling a profound, terrifying emptiness where my love for her used to be. You killed it. I'm going to go to work now because I still have to provide for my son. When I come back tonight, I want you to have figured out what you're going to tell Toby about why Uncle Mark doesn't live here anymore. And then we're going to talk about the lawyers. I didn't wait for her response. I turned around, walked out the front door, and stepped back into the cool, damp morning air, leaving the sound of her crying behind me. The drive to the office was a blur of gray highway and flashing brake lights. I didn't actually go to the construction site. I couldn't have managed a crew or looked at a blueprint if my life depended on it. Instead, I pulled into the parking lot of a quiet public park a few miles from the office, shut off the engine, and leaned my forehead against the cold steering wheel. The silence inside the truck was different now. It wasn't the frantic, panicked quiet of the night before, nor was it the white-hot fury of the confrontation. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a definitive ending. The wreckage was cleared, the truth was out, and all that remained was the vast, empty space of what used to be my life. I spent the next several hours on the phone with a divorce attorney recommended by a colleague a few years back during a casual bar conversation I never thought would apply to me. The lawyer's voice was clinical, professional, and entirely detached from the emotional violence of my morning. He spoke in terms of assets, equity, temporary custody arrangements, and legal separation agreements. It was a cold comfort, hearing my life broken down into a series of strategic legal maneuvers. It gave me a script to follow when my own mind was completely blank. By the time 3 p.m. rolled around, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the suburban streets damp and reflecting a pale, watery afternoon sun. I knew the school bus would be dropping Toby off at 3:30. I didn't want him walking into a war zone, and I didn't trust Sarah to hold herself together enough to shield him from the radiation of our imploding marriage. I started the truck and drove back to the house. When I pulled up, Mark's sedan was gone. The curb was empty. The front lawn looked exactly as it had that morning, but the front door was unlocked when I turned the knob. I walked into the foyer, my heart hammering against my ribs in a slow, heavy rhythm. The house was dead quiet. The smell of burnt bacon and stale coffee still lingered in the air, mixed with the faint scent of Sarah's tear-soaked tissues. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen island, a glass of water in front of her that she hadn't touched. Her eyes were bloodshot and heavily swollen, her face devoid of any makeup, looking older than I had ever seen her. She looked up when I walked in, her body tensing, waiting for another explosion. But I didn't have any rage left in me. I was completely empty. "He's gone," she said, her voice cracked and dry. "He took everything. He didn't even say goodbye." "Good," I said, walking to the opposite side of the counter, keeping the physical distance between us, like an invisible wall.
We have 20 minutes before Toby gets off the bus. This is how it's going to go. We are not telling him everything today. We are telling him that Mark had to leave for a new job out of state. And we are telling him that you and I need some time apart. I will sleep in the guest room tonight. And tomorrow, I'm putting a deposit down on an apartment near the office. Sarah closed her eyes, a fresh tear tracking down her cheek. David, please, can we just talk for 5 minutes? Just let me explain how there is nothing to explain, Sarah, I interrupted, my voice dropping to a flat, unyielding whisper. You've spent 6 months rewriting the history of our family with my best friend. Every time you looked at me, every time you told me you loved me, every time you let me work 80 hours a week so we could afford this life, you were making a conscious choice to destroy us. I don't care about the why anymore.
The why doesn't fix the fact that I look at you and I don't even recognize the person sitting across from me. She buried her face in her hands again, her shoulders shaking, but she didn't argue. She knew there was no defense. The evidence was absolute, and the damage was done. Exactly at 3:32 p.m., the loud, familiar squeak of the yellow school bus brakes echoed down the street. A moment later, the heavy thud of the front door opening broke the silence of the house. Toby ran into the foyer, his oversized backpack bouncing against his small shoulders, his face lit up with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child returning to his safe haven. "Dad," he yelled, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw me standing in the kitchen. "You're home early. You missed the concrete pour?" I forced my face into the most convincing smile I could manage, kneeling down so I was at his eye level as he threw his arms around my neck. The smell of his shampoo, the innocent warmth of his hug, it almost broke me right there on the floor. I felt a sob catch in my throat, but I swallowed it down, clamping my jaw tight until it ached. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, squeezing him tight. "Yeah, the job got a little delayed. I wanted to come home and see you." He pulled back, his green eyes darting between me and Sarah, instantly picking up on the strange, heavy tension in the room, despite our best efforts. Children have a radar for heartbreak that is far more sensitive than we give them credit for. He looked toward the hallway leading to the basement. "Where is Uncle Mark? His car isn't outside." Sarah cleared her throat, stepping forward with a fragile, practiced smile that looked incredibly painful. "Hey, sweetie, Uncle Mark had to leave today. He got a really big job offer in another city, and he had to pack up and go right away. He was really sad he couldn't say goodbye, but he told me to tell you he'll miss you a lot." Toby's face fell, his lower lip pushing out slightly. "But we were supposed to build the spaceship tonight. He promised." "I know, buddy," I said, gently rubbing his shoulder, my voice thick. "I know, but things change fast sometimes. Tell you what, why don't you go upstairs, change out of your school clothes, and I'll come up in a minute and we can start working on that spaceship together. Just the two of us? How does that sound?" He looked at me for a long second, searching my face for the truth, before nodding slowly. "Okay, Dad," he muttered, turning around and walking up the stairs, his footsteps much heavier than they had been when he first ran through the front door. Sarah and I stood in the kitchen, listening to his bedroom door close upstairs. The silence we turned, thicker and more suffocating than before. We looked at each other across the ruins of the life we had spent nearly a decade building. There were no more words to say, no apologies that could reconstruct the shattered glass of our trust, and no anger left to burn through the cold reality of what lay ahead. I turned away from her, leaving her alone in the quiet kitchen, and walked up the stairs to my son's room. I had a spaceship to build, a new life to figure out from scratch, and a little boy who needed to know that even when the entire world falls apart, his father would still be standing right there beside him.